You take the blonde one, and I'll take the one with the turban.
Oh, please.
Stop that!
There is a photograph that has been quietly circulating among film enthusiasts and classic comedy lovers for decades. At first glance, it looks like a candid publicity shot. Gene Wilder, doubled over, shoulders shaking, barely holding himself together, while Marty Feldman stands beside him with that legendary asymmetric gaze and a grin that could only mean trouble. People have looked at this photo and assumed it was staged. They assumed someone told Wilder to look like he was laughing, that Feldman was posed for comedic effect, that the whole thing was manufactured for a movie poster or a press kit. But here is the thing, and this is what makes it so remarkable. That photo is completely real. Nobody set it up. Nobody asked anyone to perform. The camera simply caught a moment of pure, uncontrollable human chaos on one of the most famously unruly film sets in Hollywood history. That set, of course, belonged to Young Frankenstein, Mel Brooks' 1974 masterpiece that took everything audiences thought they knew about classic horror and turned it on its head with surgical comedic precision. The film starred Gene Wilder as the neurotic, brilliant, deeply conflicted Dr. Frederick Frankenstein, alongside Peter Boyle as the monster, Marty Feldman as the unpredictable Igor, Terry Garr as the bubbly Inga, Cloris Leachman as the terrifying Frau Blucher, and Madeline Kahn as the gloriously dramatic Elizabeth. Together, they created something that film scholars, comedians, and devoted fans have studied and celebrated for over 50 years. But here is what most people do not fully appreciate when they sit down to watch Young Frankenstein today. A significant portion of what makes the film so extraordinary was never written in any script. The moments that audiences laugh hardest at, the ones that feel most alive, most spontaneous, most electrically funny, were accidents. They were blunders, slip-ups, broken props, misfired sound effects, wandering wigs, and actors who simply could not keep straight faces no matter how many times the director called for another take. And Mel Brooks, rather than demanding perfection, recognized genius when chaos handed it to him. So today, we are going to pull back the curtain on this legendary production. We are going to walk through the bloopers, the accidents, the unscripted moments, and the on-set disasters that shaped one of the greatest comedy films ever made. We will examine what actually happened behind those cameras, why certain scenes feel so raw and alive, and yes, we will come back to that photograph, the one that was not edited, the one that was not planned, and the one that tells you everything you need to know about what it was really like to make Young Frankenstein. To understand the bloopers of Young Frankenstein, you first have to understand Marty Feldman, because nearly every chaotic, unscripted, gloriously disruptive moment on that set traces back to him in some way. Feldman was a comedian and writer who had already carved out a formidable reputation in television comedy before arriving in Hollywood. He had a natural instinct for anarchy. He did not simply perform a script. He treated a script the way a musician treats sheet music, as a starting point, a suggestion, something to riff off and then leave behind entirely when inspiration struck. On the set of Young Frankenstein, Feldman's improvisational energy was both a gift and a force of nature that nobody could fully control, not even Mel Brooks. Gene Wilder, who was known for his meticulous preparation and his ability to exist entirely within a character, found himself constantly ambushed. He would be deep in a scene, fully inhabiting the frantic dignity of Dr. Frederick Frankenstein, when Feldman would do or say something so completely unexpected that Wilder's composure would simply collapse. You can actually see it happen in the finished film if you know what to look for. A flicker behind Wilder's eyes, a microscopic twitch at the corner of his mouth, a pause that lasts just a half-second too long. Those are the moments when Wilder was fighting with every professional instinct he had not to dissolve into laughter on camera. One of the most celebrated examples of this dynamic involves the scene at the very beginning of the film, when Dr. Frankenstein and his companions arrive at the castle and Igor is asked to help with the luggage. The script had a functional, straightforward exchange planned out. What actually happened when the cameras rolled was something else entirely. Feldman, apparently deciding that straightforward was not nearly interesting enough, improvised a cheeky line that nobody had anticipated. The delivery was so confident, so perfectly timed, and so completely out of nowhere that the cast around him barely held together. Wilder, in particular, can be observed in that scene doing the kind of subtle, heroic physical work that great comedic actors do when they are trying desperately not to ruin a take. Jaw slightly tightened, eyes focused somewhere in the middle distance, breath controlled. He is a man clinging to professionalism by his fingernails, and the effort itself becomes part of what makes the scene so funny. Mel Brooks saw what was happening and made a decision that defined the entire production. He kept it. He kept all of it. Rather than calling for reshoots and demanding that his actors stick rigidly to the written page, Brooks recognized that the electricity between his cast, the genuine surprise, the suppressed laughter, the spontaneous invention, was more valuable than any polished performance could ever be. This philosophy became the guiding spirit of Young Frankenstein's production, and it is the reason the film feels as alive today as it did the day it was released. Among the most quietly ingenious bloopers to make it into the final cut of Young Frankenstein is one that most audiences have watched dozens of times without ever consciously registering it as a mistake. Igor's hump moves. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but if you pay careful attention across multiple scenes, you will notice that the conspicuous hump on Igor's back does not stay in the same position from one shot to the next. In one scene it rides high on one shoulder. In another it has migrated to the other side entirely. Feldman was doing this deliberately, shifting the prosthetic hump between takes to see how long it would take for someone on set to call him out. The answer, initially, was quite a long time. The crew was busy, the days were long, and nobody was studying the hump's precise shoulder placement with any great scrutiny. Gene Wilder was the first to catch on, and when he did, rather than reporting it to the costume department, he did what any reasonable person would do when confronted with Feldman doing something deliberately absurd. He tried very hard not to laugh about it and mostly failed. Brooks eventually noticed as well, and his response was characteristic. He loved it, he encouraged it, and he made sure that the continuity error stayed in the film. The hump's mysterious migration became one of Young Frankenstein's most beloved running visual gags, something that rewards attentive viewers on repeat viewings with the quiet satisfaction of catching something that feels simultaneously accidental and brilliant. The production was equally generous with other forms of continuity chaos. Props had a habit of vanishing between shots in ways that no editor quite managed to catch before the film was locked. A candlestick carried through a darkened corridor disappears entirely between one frame and the next, leaving the characters to navigate shadows with nothing but confidence and good intentions. A coffee cup migrates between hands, appears and vanishes, and seems to obey no particular logic about where it ought to be at any given moment. These errors were the natural consequence of a production that was moving fast, improvising constantly, and reshooting scenes not because technical things went wrong but because someone could not stop laughing long enough to finish a take. What is remarkable is how completely these errors fit the world of the film. Young Frankenstein is, at its core, a loving parody of the classic horror films of decades past. Pictures that were themselves full of jump cuts, mismatched eye lines, and continuity errors born of limited budgets and tight shooting schedules. When a candlestick disappears in Young Frankenstein, it does not feel like a mistake. It feels like the film winking at its audience, acknowledging the tradition it is both honoring and gently mocking. Brooks was smart enough to understand this, which is why so many of these small errors were left precisely where they fell. There are certain sequences in Young Frankenstein that, when you learn what was happening behind the camera during their production, become even funnier than they already are. The musical number performed by Frankenstein and his monster is perhaps the most famous example. The scene, in which Dr. Frankenstein and the monster perform a formal routine in matching formal attire on a theatrical stage, to an audience of bewildered onlookers, is one of the most gloriously absurd sequences in the history of comedy. Gene Wilder had fought hard to include it. Mel Brooks had initially been skeptical, unconvinced that a full theatrical production number in the middle of a horror parody was a good idea. Wilder persisted, arguing that the sheer brazenness of the absurdity was precisely the point, and eventually Brooks relented. What followed during filming was, by all accounts, an ordeal of suppressed hilarity. Peter Boyle, beneath layers of foam rubber prosthetics, a headpiece bolted to his skull, and a formal suit that had not been designed with monster-proportioned movement in mind, was attempting to perform the routine with genuine commitment and enthusiasm. His version of the number, delivered in a booming, enthusiastic, magnificently off-pitch voice, was so unexpectedly earnest that it broke Wilder completely during multiple takes. Wilder would be standing there in his own matching outfit, ready to perform, and Boyle would open his mouth and deliver that thunderous sound, and Wilder would simply cease to be Dr. Frederick Frankenstein for the duration of his laughter. The crew fared no better. Sound technicians were reportedly struggling to maintain professional composure. Camera operators were fighting to keep their framing steady while their shoulders shook. The sequence took significantly longer to shoot than anyone had planned, for the simple reason that everyone present kept being undone by how funny it was. Brooks, watching from behind the monitor, was of no help whatsoever. His own laughter would periodically contaminate the audio track, requiring the sound department to work around it in post-production. Then there was the laboratory door that refused to cooperate. In a scene calling for Dr. Frankenstein to enter his laboratory and close the heavy wooden door firmly behind him, a simple piece of blocking that should have taken minutes to shoot, the door's hinges jammed on one take, leaving Wilder standing there with the door stubbornly wedged halfway between open and closed. Wilder did not call cut. Instead, he leaned into the problem with the instinct of a performer who has learned that genuine obstacles are often funnier than scripted ones, playing his frustration with the recalcitrant door with such committed exasperation that the scene became something richer and stranger than what was written. The crew's laughter, which they were attempting to muffle with various degrees of success, was audible enough that Brooks had to flag it in editing, but he kept the take anyway. The laboratory elevator presented its own particular challenges. The set piece was built to look appropriately threatening, all iron gratings and industrial menace. In practice, it was rather less stable than it appeared. During a scene in which several cast members were meant to ride it smoothly to an upper level, the platform began to move in ways it had not been engineered to move, producing a wobbling, lurching ascent that Terry Garr found genuinely alarming. The reaction she produced was not scripted and not performed. It was a real response to the sudden conviction that the floor beneath her feet was not behaving as floors conventionally should.